October 17th, 1898. East 90th Street, Manhattan. On a block controlled by St. Joseph's Orphan Asylum, a new chapel rises in brick and limestone, its arched openings facing the city like the entrance to a moral machine. It is not built as a small shelter. It is built as presence. It is built as authority. It is built as if the children inside are part of something larger than care, something administrative, ceremonial, and permanent. More than a century later, when newer construction is peeled back, part of that old fade reappears from behind a parking structure, as though the building had not vanished at all, only been pushed behind another layer of history. And that is where this story begins. Not with rumor, but with masonry. Not with fantasy, but with something physically hidden in plain sight. Because once you begin tracing the orphanages built before 1900, you keep finding the same uneasy pattern: monumental child institutions tied to churches, overseen by elite boards, later demolished, covered, repurposed, or partially swallowed by new city growth. These buildings do not feel accidental. They feel connected. They feel as though they belong to a system that ran above ground in public language, charity, salvation, reform, guardianship, and below ground in corridors the public was never meant to follow. And if that sounds too dramatic, then the question becomes even more important. Why do so many of these institutions leave behind the same visual signatures of buried levels, sealed passageways, erased wings, and architectural links to church and civic power? Subscribe to my channel if you're drawn to hidden history, buried records, erased institutions, forgotten systems, old world architecture, and the paper trails they hoped no one would follow. And tell me where you are listening from. I want to know where this investigation is reaching. The first mistake modern people make is imagining the orphanage as a standalone refuge. In the 19th century, that was rarely true. Orphanages were often nodes in larger institutional webs made up of churches, schools, relief boards, hospitals, burial grounds, work systems, and court-linked forms of oversight. The Chicago Orphan Asylum, opened in 1849, emerged from a Protestant civic network that included ministers, judges, physicians, and wealthy city founders. The institution was presented as moral rescue, but it also functioned as organized management, a replacement for poorhouse commitment and child indenture. In other words, the orphanage did not simply shelter children, it absorbed them into an ordered system. That matters because once a child institution is tied to churches and civic leaders from its founding, its architecture starts to tell a different story. It begins to reflect permanence, hierarchy, and surveillance. A poor family house does not need a ceremonial fade. A temporary shelter does not require a monumental campus. But an institution designed to classify, educate, discipline, redistribute, and morally reframe children, that kind of building wants weight. It wants symbolic legitimacy. It wants to look older than the children who enter it, and more durable than the lives that disappear inside it. In London, the Foundling Hospital became one of the most visible charitable monuments of its age. Chartered in 1739, built on a major site in Bloomsbury, supported by governors, artists, merchants, and reformers, it was never hidden from power. It was power recast as benevolence. It had a chapel. It had elite patronage. It had public image. It even turned moral care into cultural spectacle through art and benefit music. That is not peripheral architecture. That is central architecture. That is the built form of a society announcing that abandoned children will be handled under the gaze of church morality, elite governance, and public ceremony. The chapel is one of the clearest clues in this entire landscape. Again and again, the religious structure is not an afterthought, but a core organizing feature. At St. Joseph's Orphan Asylum in Manhattan, the 1898 chapel served both as a gathering space for the children and as the main chapel for the parish. At St. Michael's Orphanage in New Jersey, a chapel was added in 1905 with the dining room below, the sanctuary above, and even a crypt holding the remains of Bishop O'Farrell. At the Foundling Hospital, the chapel was central enough to host Handel's famous benefit performances. That repeated placement changes the meaning of the campus. The chapel was not there just to comfort grief. It sanctified administration. It wrapped institutional control in ritual language. It transformed intake, discipline, and confinement into moral duty. It told donors they were part of mercy. It told children their suffering had order. It told the public the institution belonged to heaven and history, not merely to paperwork. And once a chapel becomes central, the orphanage is no longer just a social service site. It becomes a theater of moral authority. Now place that chapel beside city elites, judges, trustees, relief boards, and parish networks, and the building begins to look less like a home and more like a transfer point between worlds, family and institution, private life and public record, baptism and bureaucracy, abandonment and classification. Above ground, the language is salvation. But beneath that language sits logistics, and logistics always leave architectural marks. This is where the story turns. Because if you look at old institutional buildings, orphanages, hospitals, asylums, schools, poorhouses, one visual anomaly returns over and over: windows below present street level, blocked arches, half-visible foundations, stairways descending into sealed voids, doors that appear to lead nowhere, and remnants of lower stories that feel less like basements than lost first floors. Now, responsible history requires caution. There is no reputable evidence that every orphanage built before 1900 literally sat atop a hidden buried floor. But there is solid evidence that many of these buildings experienced repeated expansions, grade changes, new additions, later demolitions, and partial encasements inside newer structures. At St. Joseph's, the surviving chapel fade remained embedded in later construction for decades. It was not imaginary. It was physically concealed by a newer urban shell. At St. Michael's, the campus evolved through additions, connected service areas, passageways, wings, and later demolition with poor documentation. When a site is repeatedly rebuilt, covered, or repurposed, what survives can look eerily like a buried world beneath the official one. And this is precisely why the buried floor motif refuses to die. Because people are seeing something real, even if they sometimes explain it badly. They are seeing layered construction. They are seeing the physical result of institutions that changed names, uses, populations, and narratives, while keeping pieces of their old body underground or behind later walls. The official explanation may be mundane: altered street grade, new foundations, site redevelopment, demolition debris, repurposed basements. But the emotional effect is not mundane. It feels like the building is withholding testimony. And in a hidden history documentary, that is where the real tension lives, not in claiming impossible certainty, but in showing how normal explanations can still point to abnormal systems. Once you accept that large institutional campuses were layered and complex, the next question becomes harder to dismiss. Were tunnels and hidden passages actually used around children's institutions? In some cases, yes. The clearest supporting context comes from campuses that combined multiple care functions. On the Immanuel Deaconess campus in Omaha, a sprawling institutional site that included a hospital, an orphanage, an old folks' home, and a mental health facility, tunnels ran more than 15 feet underground between buildings. They carried utilities, yes, but they also moved people. According to the site history, the tunnels were used to transport patients, including the dying and the mentally unstable, and some sanitarium patients were moved underground because enclosed tunnels made escape more difficult. That source does not prove that every pre-1900 orphanage had a secret tunnel to a church or courthouse. But it destroys the lazy assumption that underground movement on child and care campuses was fictional. It was practical. It was institutional. It was often invisible to the public. And once a campus includes children, clergy, medical staff, service buildings, burial spaces, kitchens, laundries, and winter transport needs, an underground passage stops sounding exotic. It starts sounding efficient. So the strongest version of the argument is not that all rumors are true. It is that the historical conditions for hidden circulation absolutely existed. Large campuses did use passageways. Service corridors did connect functions the public was not meant to see. And the more dependent the population, the stronger the incentive to move bodies quietly, efficiently, and out of sight. If you've ever seen an old orphanage, school, convent, courthouse, or hospital in your town with sealed windows, bricked-up doors, or stories about tunnels that locals dismiss as myth, leave it in the comments. Those fragments matter more than people think. Now we come to the third building in this recurring triangle, the courthouse. Even when orphanages were church-linked, the lives inside them were rarely governed by religion alone. Children entered systems of guardianship, inspection, indenture, adoption, probation, truancy enforcement, and charitable oversight. Their identities were processed through records, and records have always been the courthouse's natural language. This is why the hidden history imagination keeps pairing orphanages with courthouses. Not because every property line proves a tunnel, but because the legal life of the child sat much closer to civic power than the sentimental language of charity admits. And historically, courthouses themselves often participated in underground circulation systems. Official records describe tunnel links between courthouse buildings and other government structures, especially where hidden transport and secure movement were required. Again, that is not direct proof of orphanage to courthouse tunnels in every case. But it confirms something more important for this script. 19th and early 20th century civic architecture already accepted the logic of subterranean transfer. If prisoners could be moved underground, if service lines could be buried, if dependent populations could be routed through back passages, then the culture of hidden movement was already normal inside the same bureaucratic world that managed children. So when oral histories or local rumors place an orphanage, a church, and a courthouse inside the same whispered map, the responsible response is not to laugh. It is to ask whether the rumor may be exaggerating a real institutional logic that history later simplified beyond recognition. There is another layer here that is easy to miss if you focus only on architecture. The orphanage system itself was often built as a replacement mechanism. In Chicago, privately controlled orphan asylums were praised for saving children from poorhouses and indenture. In Philadelphia, institutions like Girard College emerged as monumental answers to social problems, designed to turn vulnerable children into disciplined future citizens. In London, the Foundling Hospital was framed as rescue from infant death and abandonment, but it also converted exposed children into morally legible subjects within a larger philanthropic order. That is why these buildings often feel overbuilt for their stated purpose. They were not merely houses for children. They were instruments for replacing one social reality with another. Family with institution. Local memory with record-keeping. Disorder with discipline. Birth identity with assigned future. And when a building is designed to support replacement, the spaces no one talks about become even more important. Intake rooms, service corridors, records offices, chapels, laundry wings, boiler houses, infirmaries, burial corners, and whatever passages linked those zones together. This is where the script's darker suspicion becomes legitimate. Not that every story of tunnels is proven, but that the institutions themselves were designed to manage transitions that children did not choose and the public did not fully witness. The reason these topics generate so much intensity today is because the records so often thin out exactly where the questions become most serious. Buildings are demolished with sparse documentation. Towers are removed. Interiors are converted. Chapels become garages. Wings disappear from photographs. Campuses are sold off in pieces. Institutions close, reopen under new names, or shift into schools, treatment centers, state wards facilities, or private developments. At St. Joseph's, the bell tower was likely removed. The chapel interior was converted into a garage, and the surviving fade was almost hidden again under a new project. At St. Michael's, the main orphanage complex was demolished in 1973, and the documentation of that demolition is described as minimal. In Omaha, later housing development rose above land once threaded with tunnels. When the surface changes and the lower system remains unspoken, memory starts to fracture, and once memory fractures, the institution wins twice. First, by controlling the people who pass through it. Second, by controlling the language later generations use to describe it. Suddenly the orphanage becomes a home. The intake network becomes charity. The crypt becomes heritage. The sealed passage becomes just infrastructure. And the child at the center of the system disappears behind the architecture meant to save them. That is the pattern hidden history audiences are feeling, even when they do not yet have the archive to articulate it cleanly. So let's separate the cinematic claim from the defensible one. I cannot honestly tell you that every orphanage built before 1900 sat above buried floors with sealed tunnels connecting directly to nearby churches and courthouses. The surviving evidence does not justify that total statement. But I can tell you something more historically solid and, in some ways, more disturbing. I can tell you that orphanages before 1900 were often embedded in church and civic networks powerful enough to shape children's lives from intake to placement. I can tell you that chapels were often central to the institution's architecture and identity, not decorative additions. I can tell you that some child and care campuses absolutely used underground passages and extended service connections. I can tell you that repeated rebuilding, demolition, encasement, and grade change created real visual evidence of hidden or half-lost lower levels. And I can tell you that official memory often became thinner, softer, and more selective as these institutions were repurposed or erased. That is not a weaker narrative than the rumor. It is stronger. Because it means the hidden story does not depend on proving a single underground map. The hidden story is the system itself, a system that fused religion, philanthropy, administration, and physical architecture into a machine for absorbing children whose original homes had already failed or been taken from them. So the next time you pass an orphanage ruin, a chapel wall trapped inside a newer building, a courthouse block with sealed service entries, or an old institutional campus where locals still whisper about tunnels, do not ask only whether the legend is true. Ask why the legend had enough surviving architecture to be believable in the first place. Ask why so many child institutions were built like fortresses of mercy. Ask why chapels sat at their center. Ask why lower levels vanish into altered ground. Ask why demolition records become thin. Ask why the same buildings keep returning in fragments, fade without campus, crypt without congregation, foundation without explanation. Because maybe the real hidden network was never only underground. Maybe it ran through stone, paper, ritual, custody, and silence. Maybe the tunnels people remember are the physical echo of a deeper system, one that moved children between church authority, civic authority, and institutional life so efficiently that later generations inherited only the shell and the rumor. Tell me where you are listening from. You will be part of the community that keeps tracing these erased systems, one fade, one record, one sealed passage at a time. And once you see the pattern, it becomes very difficult to walk past these buildings and call them ordinary again.